Picture this. The Pope declares a crusade. Bells ring out across Europe. Knights strap on their armor. Priests deliver sermons about holy war against the infidels. And at that very same moment, in the port of Venice, ships are being loaded. Except they're not carrying weapons against the Saracens. They're carrying timber, iron, and slaves, straight to Egypt, straight to the enemy, straight to the very place the Pope has just banned all trade with, under threat of excommunication. And nobody stopped them for 300 years. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't the recklessness of a few bold individuals. This was state policy, deliberate, consistent, and extraordinarily profitable. And to understand how something like this was even possible, you first need to understand what Venice actually was. Because the answer isn't obvious. And the standard version of this story leaves out the most interesting part. Most people picture medieval Europe as a world where religion governed everything: wars, alliances, trade, law. All of it was either blessed by the church or condemned by it. The Pope wasn't merely a spiritual leader. He was a political force of the First Order, and his word theoretically held power over every Christian ruler on the continent. Kings trembled at the threat of excommunication. Entire kingdoms went to war because Rome pointed a finger. The idea of simply ignoring the Pope, not in secret, not with apologies, but as a matter of routine policy, was almost unthinkable. Almost. Because Venice was built differently. Not as a feudal kingdom of knights and vassals, not as a church state run by bishops and monks. Venice was a merchant republic, and that changed absolutely everything. There were no great landowners here accumulating power through territory and bloodline. Power here flowed from capital, from cargo manifests, from the weight of silk and pepper moving through the holds of ships. Decisions were made by people who counted money, people who knew the price of every commodity and every alliance, people who understood perfectly well holy war is fine for the salvation of the soul. But who exactly is going to trade with the Levant while everyone else is fighting? And that is where the real story begins. When Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, Venice didn't charge into battle out of religious fervor. Venice did the math, and what it found was that participation in the campaign was an opportunity to negotiate trading privileges in the territories that would be conquered. They provided the ships. They set their own terms. In return, they took merchant quarters in the port cities of the Levant. Entire neighborhoods, essentially sovereign Venetian soil inside foreign cities, with their own courts, their own warehouses, their own rules. And then they went right back to trading with the Muslim, as if no crusade had ever happened. Officially, Venice was a Christian republic. In practice, it was a neutral middleman between two worlds at war with each other. And it guarded that neutrality with surgical precision. Papal bans on trading with the infidel existed. Venice violated them, openly, systematically, generation after generation. Egyptian sultans received Venetian timber for their naval fleets. Venetian merchants received Egyptian spices for European markets. Everyone was satisfied, except the Pope. But the Pope was far away. The prophet was right there. And here is what makes this genuinely remarkable. It wasn't as though Venice was operating in the shadows. Everyone knew. The Pope knew. The Crusader kingdoms knew. The Muslim rulers of Egypt knew. There was no pretense of secrecy. Venetian ships flying the banner of St. Mark sailed openly into Alexandria, while European knights were bleeding in the Palestinian desert. This wasn't a scandal that occasionally surfaced. It was simply the way things worked. The open secret at the center of the medieval Mediterranean world. The most astonishing part of this story isn't even the trade itself. It's how Venice managed to explain it to its contemporaries. Whenever pressure from Rome grew too intense, Venetian diplomats would appear at the papal court, bearing gifts, bearing arguments, and bearing a quiet reminder. It was Venetian ships that carried pilgrims to the Holy Land. It was Venetian galleys that could deliver crusaders to wherever they needed to go, or not deliver them. This was blackmail, wrapped in the silk of diplomacy. And it worked, again and again, because Venice understood the one thing the Pope did not have: a fleet, the routes, contacts on both sides of the Mediterranean. Remove Venice from the equation, and the entire Mediterranean world order falls apart. The Crusader states in the Holy Land depended on Venetian supply line. The pilgrimage trade ran through Venetian ports. Even the grain that fed parts of southern Europe moved on Venetian vessels. The Republic hadn't just made itself rich, it had made itself structurally indispensable. And that indispensability was the most powerful diplomatic weapon in existence. By the middle of the 13th century, the situation had reached a point of outright absurdity. Venetian merchants were trading with Egypt in the middle of the Crusades. Egyptian armies were fighting against the very Crusaders, who had been transported there on Venetian ships. Venice was collecting revenue from both sides. The chroniclers of the time wrote about it with horror. One Franciscan friar described Venetian merchants as men who would sell the nails of the true cross if the price were right. Popes threatened excommunication. Venice paid the fines and carried on, because the fines cost less than the profit. And occasionally, Venice didn't even pay the fine. It negotiated them down, or offered something in return. A military contribution here, a diplomatic favor there. The relationship between Venice and the papacy was less that of a disobedient subject and its master, and more that of two powers that needed each other, and both knew it. Rome needed Venetian logistics. Venice needed Roman legitimacy. So they performed this strange, centuries-long dance, the Pope condemning, Venice apologizing, both parties quietly understanding that nothing would actually change. That is the real heart of the Venetian phenomenon. Not that they were cynics or godless men. Most Venetian merchants were genuinely devout. They built churches, donated to monasteries, commissioned masses. The Basilica of St. Mark, one of the most breathtaking religious buildings in all of Europe, was funded by the same trading fortunes that kept Egyptian shipyards stocked with Venetian timber. It was simply that in their worldview, trade and faith occupied parallel planes of existence. Faith governed Sundays, trade governed the rest of the week. And when those planes collided, trade won. There is something almost philosophical about that separation. In a world where everyone else claimed that God and commerce were inseparable, where crusades were supposedly driven by faith, but were clearly also driven by land and plunder, where the church condemned usury, but quietly accepted donations from moneylenders. Venice was simply more honest about the arrangement. They didn't pretend the sacred and the profitable were always the same thing. They kept the accounts separate and slept perfectly well at night. 300 years later, when the Ottomans seized Constantinople and rewrote the map of the known world, many European powers collapsed or retreated. The old Crusader mentality had no answer for what had just happened. Venice opened trade negotiations with the Ottoman Sultan. Within a few years, Venetian merchants had obtained new commercial privileges from the very empire that had just destroyed the last remnant of Christian Byzantium. While popes called for new crusades that never materialized, Venetian ships were already moving through Ottoman-controlled waters under formal agreement. The pattern had simply repeated itself. A new power had emerged. Venice had found its angle. Business continued. That is the true lesson of Venice. Not a story about betrayal, not a story about shamelessness, but a story about how a state built around commerce develops a peculiar immunity to ideological catastrophe. Empires rise and fall on the strength of their beliefs. Venice rose and endured on the strength of its balance sheets. While others were dying for the truth, Venice was selling it to both sides. And that is precisely why it survived as an independent republic longer than any empire that ever surrounded it. The Byzantines are gone. The Crusader kingdoms are gone. The medieval papacy as a political superpower is gone. Venice, the city built on water, on compromise, on the quiet understanding that profit outlasts principle, lasted over 1,000 years. Make of that what you will.
You don't want to miss our next video, so make sure to subscribe.